You're listening to the Corbett Report. CorbettReport.com.
Good evening, friends. Welcome to the broadcast. You are tuned into Corbett Report Radio here on the Republic Broadcasting Network, and I'm your host, as always, James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, coming to you tonight, as every night, from the sunny climes of Western Japan. So thank you all for tuning in once again for the broadcast, wherever, whenever, and however you're listening. And tonight we have quite a conversation lined up for you, as it is just coming across the news wires here that my home and native land of Canada has recently declared Iran to be the greatest threat to peace and stability in the world, and has subsequently dispelled all Iranian diplomats from Canada and withdrawn Canadian diplomats from Iran. So, who knows what's coming down the line, but it certainly seems that there is a concerted effort to demonize Iran as much as possible and to not look at the elephant in the room when it comes to the Middle East and what's going on there, which of course is Israel. So tonight we're going to be talking about these types of issues and some of those elephants in the room and exposing what the real threat to stability and peace might be and who the real nuclear power in the region is. And to do that, we're going to be talking to Grant F. Smith of the Institute for Research Middle Eastern Policy. That is IRMEP, IRMEP, at irmep.org. And of course, the link for that will be in tonight's show notes at corbettreport.com/radio. So let's bring him up on the line. Grant Smith, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, I'm looking forward to this conversation. Lots and lots of news and information to talk about, and lots of declassified documents that you yourself have been getting out of the FBI and other organizations for researching your book and some of the other things you're working on. Before we get into some of those specific issues, though, IRMEP is, once again, the Institute for Research Middle Eastern Policy. For those people out there in the audience who haven't heard about it before, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about IRMEP and how it came to be.
Sure. We launched in early 2003 in a Capitol Hill symposium, bringing together various people to discuss the 1996 clean break plan that was written for Benjamin Netanyahu, and whether there was a concerted neoconservative effort to get the U.S. to implement that plan. Since then, we have brought together researchers for various projects, ranging from up to 10 people to one, to study various aspects of U.S. Middle East policy development and really try and peek behind the curtain and see how policy is really formulated in Washington, D.C. And so document declassification about major issues such as the Israeli nuclear weapons program, arms transfers, policy development, the major lobbies that are involved in policy formulation. All of those things are an intense focus to our research.
And you yourself have been involved with IRMEP since its beginning, then?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been involved in research all my career, beginning in market research, doing international research, doing various types of directed market studies. But in terms of the Institute for Research Middle Eastern Policy, I am the founder.
Absolutely. Well, tons of information coming out of irmep.org, so I hope people will check it out if they haven't done so before. And tonight we're going to be talking about a wide range of subjects, but probably focusing quite a bit on some very interesting stories to come out of your investigations into the Israeli nuclear smuggling ring that was operating in the U.S., certainly there in the 1960s, and that really helped to get the Israeli nuclear program underway by getting its hands on U.S. weapons-grade nuclear materials and nuclear Krytron parts and other such things. Will be, of course, telling you all about these types of things and getting some of the background to these stories. But right now, let's take a short break. If you're online at the moment, perhaps you want to go to irmep.org and start taking a look at some of the stories that are posted up there. But we'll take a short break and we'll be right back, once again talking to Grant F. Smith about irmep.org. So we'll be back right after this.
Don't mean a thing. All you gotta do
All right, friends,
is
welcome back to the
swing.
program. Once again, I'm your host, James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, and tonight we're talking to Grant F. Smith, the director of URMEP, the Institute for Research in Middle Eastern Policy, urmep.org, and we're going to be getting into some of the nuclear secrets of Israel, which, of course, is not an officially declared nuclear power, and it is not a signatory to the NPT, unlike Iran, which is a signatory and which is complying with the IAEA in multiple respects, but is still being declared the biggest threat to peace and stability on the planet by the Canadian government and many others. And the Canadian government even declaring it a state sponsor of terror now and refusing to have anything to do with it diplomatically. So there seems to be a double standard in relations in the Middle East from the major Western powers. So let's start exploring some of the issues that are not being reported anywhere in the mainstream media. Surprise, surprise. And one of the big ones that really came across the news wires for those who were paying attention back in July was a story broken by URMEP and Grant Smith. And I believe this is in relation to the work that you've been doing for some time, and some of which has ended up in books such as Divert, NUMEC, Zalman Shapiro, and the diversion of U.S. weapons-grade uranium into the Israeli nuclear weapons program, which is a title and a half. And that is available from Amazon and other places, so I will put that link in the show notes for tonight's episode as well. But let's start talking about some of the documents that you've gotten out of this investigation, and specifically I want to start with an explosive story that unfortunately we haven't heard of from any mainstream sources. This is Netanyahu worked inside nuclear smuggling ring. Tell us about the documents you found and what they've exposed.
Sure. Well, you absolutely guessed right. We've been declassifying documents about smuggling fronts for years and years, and they don't always come out in time for the book publications. But basically, our study of conventional weapons smuggling that started off in the late 40s, going after World War II surplus, companies like Martech, Service Airways, Materials for Palestine. We brought that into the nuclear age by looking at front companies that were going after nuclear materials. Of course, there weren't as many companies doing that because it's a much more concentrated effort. But the work that we were doing to look at the Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation and MILCO are very related. Anthology, I should mention, is a recent day one. In terms of the FBI uncovering a multi-node network, this one happened to be centered in California. MILCO was a company that was incorporated in 1972 by a man named Richard Kelly Smythe, who, when he was discovered sending 800 Krytrons, which are dual-use items that could be used to trigger nuclear weapons, when he was discovered doing that, he skipped bail in the mid-1980s and disappeared until he was picked up by Interpol in the early part of 2000. And so the story is interesting and explosive because after multiple attempts and denials, we had a document release in which the key contact, or one of the key contacts that Smythe was meeting with to set up sales in Israel, was none other than Benjamin Netanyahu. And so the document, which I'm kind of holding up right here for the people who are on video, actually names Benjamin Netanyahu as being an employee of Heli Trading Company, which was the node in Israel that would receive Ministry of Defense requisitions that they would pass on to MILCO. And so the interesting thing about this, of course, is the high-profile nature of Benjamin Netanyahu, the fact that the smuggling ringleader has been identified as Arnon Milchan, a person any American knows for his movie productions such as Pretty Woman and other favorites, who is running this and who a recent book has named as being a top economic espionage spy for Lacom, who worked under Benjamin Bloomberg and Raphael Eitan. But the FBI document that we published on July 4 related to an antiwar.com story was really short and direct. And its core focus was on the fact that in a period when Netanyahu was building himself up as a leader in the terrorism industry, hosting major conferences, having just returned from his studies in the United States, hosting major conferences in the Jonathan Netanyahu Terrorism Institute, named after his brother who was killed on the raid on Entebbe. Here's a person who was supposed to be working as a furniture company executive, and yet these documents, which are very credible because of what they were, which is testimony from Richard Kelly Smith after he was returned from his exile overseas and finally forced to serve a prison sentence. These were the statements that he made to FBI agents in a district attorney office when they debriefed him and wanted to know what the extent of the nuclear technology smuggling network was. And boom, there's Benjamin Netanyahu.
Pretty explosive stuff. And what, if any, indication is there from what the FBI did or didn't actually do with this knowledge that they acquired from Richard Kelly Smith?
Well, what they did was that they discovered just how connected the U.S. operatives were. In the terms of Richard Kelly Smith, after they debriefed him, he was sentenced to a much reduced sentence. He was facing over 100 years in prison for having shipped under false pretenses and without the proper export licenses 800 Krytrons to Israel. Israel clearly needed this type of technology. Only 5 years before, it had been offering to sell nuclear-tipped Jericho missiles to apartheid South Africa, according to Sasha Polikow-Saransky's work. And so there was a real need for this type of technology. The FBI, however, spent a great deal of its investigation trying to figure out whether they could do anything about Arnon Milchan. And they have an entry from Who's Who in America. They have testimony about his different stars and movie producers that he was familiar with. And so while they made a valiant effort to crack Richard Kelly Smythe into fingering Milchan and bringing him down, in the end, they simply shut down the investigation. And anybody who looks at files having to do with this sort of thing understands that the Justice Department is usually very reticent to prosecute a case that goes so high in terms of the Israeli government or U.S. Figures of this stature.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately so. So, of course, nothing really resulted from the Netanyahu connection, and I'm assuming they never really followed up on that, or there are no documents that you have on that.
In terms of the documents, they clearly named Netanyahu, but at this particular time, it's important to remember just how close Netanyahu was becoming to the U.S. government. We're talking about kind of smack dab in the middle of the Iran-Contra scandal. We're talking about a time right after the 1979 Iranian Revolution when Israel lost its greatest friend in the Middle East, where it was getting its oil and doing all sorts of economic development with the Shah. And this is the period in time when U.S. economic relations with Israel were becoming closer. So Netanyahu was interesting because he quickly became untouchable. He, in this period of time, after he was forming his credentials as kind of a terrorism guru, became the assistant to the U.S. ambassador in Washington, D.C. So suddenly he had diplomatic immunity. And again, the window is really interesting. 1980 to 1982 is when the Krytrons were shipped to Israel. By 1982, he's working in Washington, D.C. with a lot more immunity than Richard Kelly Smythe had, which is why he fled the United States.
Interesting stuff. So let's just get some clarification on Netanyahu's role. He was the Israeli end of this smuggling node, working with Heli Trading Company. What was this, and what were they doing in this scheme?
Well, Heli Trading Company was one of a single company within the Milchan Brothers conglomerate, which was started, as I believe I mentioned, in 1950 as kind of an importer of pesticides and agricultural chemicals, but then had a lot of different businesses and different industries, including arms. And so we're talking about multi-million dollar companies. in terms of his resume, Netanyahu has never been named as working at this company. And yet the person who was most directly responsible for sending the nuclear triggers to Israel says that this was his man, this was his contact in Heli Trading. And so it appears as though during a period of his life when he may have been, working at a furniture company, or that was perhaps a cover, some sort of cover for other activities, but at the same time he's becoming a terrorism guru. Netanyahu is also the key contact for this particular project. And, his patrons in terms of politics, naming him to become ambassador to the UN and all of these other positions, was Shimon Peres, who, of course, is the grandfather of the Israeli nuclear weapons program. So I don't find it troubling at all that he would have been named as a contact. Obviously, Smythe, coming from the United States, would encounter Netanyahu, who had, been studying at MIT and spending so many years of his life in the U.S. to be a very comfortable interface. And I think that would have been the purpose, somebody who is knowledgeable, moving up. But he also mentions the fact that he was introduced to Prime Minister Sharon. I mean, it's misspelled in the FBI document, but he was brought around to people so that he could be sure, I believe, that he was dealing with high-level needs and that they would have his back, which, of course, they didn't in the end.
Exactly, of course. So a very interesting story, and I suppose it shouldn't surprise us that he was meeting people who would later go on to become such important political figures, given the role that they were playing in this extremely sensitive operation. Well, let's leave it there. We're coming up against another break. When we come back, we'll continue talking to Grant F. Smith of urmep.org about the secret Israeli nuclear smuggling ring in the United States and all the documents that back it up. Okay, friends, welcome back to the broadcast. Once again, James Corbett of CorbettReport.com. You're tuned into Corbett Report Radio, and tonight we're talking to our guest, Grant F. Smith of urmep.org, about the Israeli nuclear smuggling ring, of which Benjamin Netanyahu, was fingered as being a part of that ring. A very, very interesting story. And before the break, we were talking about some of the elements of this particular part of the story and the 800 Krytron nuclear triggers that were part of this this whole scandal. But you did mention that these triggers were dual use and that one of their uses could be as a nuclear triggering device. Is there any indication that we have that these Krytrons could have possibly been used for anything other than nuclear triggers?
Well, that's the question that immediately surfaced in 1985. And Arnon Milchan had the chance to respond to Tom Friedman's pointed questions in a New York Times article. And he mentioned the fact that, and Israel as well, the government formally denied that they had any intentions of using them for nuclear purposes. And so Arnon Milchan went as far to posit that they could be used as timers to heat cholent, which is a bean stew on the Sabbath. And Tom Friedman very graciously let him make that argument. But the bottom line is it was not a soup kitchen that was asking for these particular items. It was the Ministry of Defense. And the FBI paper trail and later reporting clearly led through, Milko, Heli, Milchan brothers, right back to the Ministry of Defense. And so, given the means, motive, and opportunity of this particular acquisition project, and the fact that they didn't want to give them back, subsequent news reports have the State Department and the United States formally trying to get the things back with little success. I tend to think that the reason that they took the chances to file false export declarations was that they really needed them, and that if they'd wanted to simply acquire some soup timers, they could have gotten conventional technologies for that.
One would think so. There's probably easier ways to go about getting soup warmers going. Just to clarify for people out there who are wondering, all of these documents are available for download from the URMEP site?
They are. In fact, it's the site has got thousands and thousands of PDF documents, most of which have never seen the light of day that we were the first ones to declassify. And as you mentioned, this covers economic espionage, nuclear smuggling. It covers clandestine activities to lobbying for trade agreements. And so if people go simply Google Israel Lobby Archive, they'll be able to see all of these documents. Usually there's an image and a quote from one of the declassified documents and some context about what it's talking about. But they cover a period from the 1930s all the way to the present.
Well, let's talk about the way that this story, this explosive story really, about Benjamin Netanyahu has been received in the American media, or more properly, has not been received.
Yeah, well, it's not been received. In fact, I dialed into the Diane Rehm show, which is a giant public policy show that's syndicated on National Public Radio, and it was as though I had dragged an elephant carcass onto the set. They shut me down so fast and threw me off, it left my head spinning. And so there's, the story is out there. The files have been sent to the New York Times, the Washington Post. We put out a PR Newswire press release. And the only outlets that have bothered to cover it have been Israeli National News, the Israeli version of the Wall Street Journal, and some prominent U.S. blogs, and that is absolutely it. I think this is so far outside the framework that nobody wants to deal with it. And again, your listeners probably understand that's there are many stories like that, particularly now.
It's so sad that this isn't surprising in any way that this type of story isn't getting any traction, but it does just go so counter to the narrative that's being put out there right now about Iran, and the Iran being the root of all evil and the root of all nuclear evil in the region, that anything that goes against that in terms of what Israel has just can't be reported on. So unfortunately, nothing new there, I guess, nothing surprising from your perspective, right?
No, and this isn't the first time, but, some stories that we've put out, they have made it into the Washington Post. This one, it would require some efforts. It would probably require some verification on the part of these. I'm still holding out hope that these organizations will contextualize it. But the Washington Post recently ran a long piece from their ombudsman, which, if you read it carefully, justifies why they don't want to talk about the Israeli nuclear weapons program. And it has a lot to do with maintaining the strategic ambiguity and not wanting to out a friend, as the ombudsman said. And so, there were thousands and thousands of comments on the page calling them out on that. But I think they're going to close ranks and hold firm, because if people really understood that what's being asked is to preserve the nuclear hegemony of one particular country in the region, they probably wouldn't accept most of the rest of the argument, particularly when they find out the main person making it actually targeted the U.S. for some of his arsenal.
Exactly right. All the news that's fit to print, unless it exposes Israel's nuclear program, I guess. Just a ridiculous state of affairs, considering it is not a secret anymore, and everyone knows about it. But there you go. That's the state we're in. Well, let's leave it there. Again, coming up against a break, we're talking to Grant F. Smith. If you'd like to get in on tonight's conversation, the phone lines will be open 1-800-313-9443. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to the program, friends. Welcome back to Corbett Report Radio. I am James Corbett of CorbettReport.com. Tonight we're talking to Grant F. Smith of the Institute for Research Middle Eastern Policy. That's irmep.org, irmep.org. We'll take you there, where you can find all of these articles and the declassified documents that we're talking about tonight, as we start uncovering the various smuggling rings and other things that Israel has been involved in over the years, directed against the United States. Not that you'll find any of this reported on in the U.S. media. So let's start taking a look at the bigger picture of what's happening here, because of course the Netanyahu angle is only one small piece of a much bigger puzzle, and one that, as I say, you've been working on for your book, Divert, NUMEC, Zalman Shapiro, and the diversion of U.S. weapons-grade uranium into the Israeli nuclear weapons program. which is available for purchase online, and I hope people will take a look at it. But let's start talking about this the problem generally, what NUMEC was, who Zalman Shapiro was, and how this all originated.
Sure. Well, Zalman Shapiro was a really talented chemist who worked on the Nautilus nuclear submarine program for Admiral Hyman Rickover back in the late 1950s. And during this time, the vision for Atoms for Peace was beginning to kick off, and the idea of having private companies run nuclear-related industries came into legislative possibility. So Zalman Shapiro, under the guidance of a venture capitalist who had been an Israeli smuggler, put together a nuclear fuel processing plant to sell fuel to the nuclear navy in a facility they acquired for $500 in Apollo, Pennsylvania. It was an old steel mill, and began receiving a steady stream of highly enriched U-235 to process into submarine fuel. The Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation was severely undercapitalized. They had horrible facilities, numerous fires, all sorts of spills and chemical fires. And it became apparent by 1964 and 1965 that somehow they had managed to lose vast quantities of U-235. And so there began an investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which took place until the early 70s and then was relaunched in 1978 to 1980 to find out what had happened to the weapons-grade uranium. The investigation files are fascinating. People who don't want to buy the book can certainly look at all of these interview files where FBI agents are crawling all over the plant and beginning to uncover the corporate history of NUMEC. The fact that NUMEC set up a joint venture called ISORAD with the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission. The Israeli Atomic Energy Commission, in terms of the research of Abner Cohen, a real expert on the Israeli nuclear weapons program, was simply a front for the Israeli nuclear weapons program. And all sorts of key figures of the Israeli nuclear weapons program, such as Avraham Hermoni, were constantly visiting the plant. Raphael Eitan, the famous Israeli spy who snatched Nazi war criminals off the streets of Buenos Aires and later ran Jonathan Pollard against the United States, visited the plant with an operations team in 1968. And so this plant was constantly losing weapons-grade uranium, and the Atomic Energy Commission finally engineered the ouster of Zalman Shapiro by having another company take it over at a substantial loss and let Shapiro go into another industry. So the story is fascinating because during the Ford administration, Congress was under a lot of pressure by constituents and others to explain what had happened to all the missing uranium. In the early 1970s, Henry Kissinger mentions in a formal report that there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that the material was shipped to Israel, that had been mounted on one of the new missiles that they were putting together, ballistic missiles. And so the paper trail is fascinating. I would say every bit as much as fascinating as the inability of the government to take any concrete action. They had numerous possibilities for putting a polygraph on Zalman Shapiro since he had security clearances. They had numerous opportunities to cut to the chase and use CIA assets overseas to find out various things. And they did find uranium of the signature of that which was shipped to NUMEC in Israel by the late 1970s. But in every key moment, there was a change in presidential administration or the loss of this attorney general, or the FBI didn't want to deal with it anymore. So that even by 1980, when they have, as the documents on the irmep.org website show, an eyewitness, an employee who witnessed Zalman Shapiro loading HEU containers into equipment for shipment to Israel. Even though they had that eyewitness testimony, they couldn't proceed with any type of investigation because the Carter administration was winding down. They had a huge file on NUMEC by that time, but there's no indication that they handed it over to the Reagan administration for further prosecution. And so it's a really interesting time period, and it's clear to people who are experts who have reviewed the losses at the NUMEC plant, such as Victor Galinsky, who wrote an article for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists called Revisiting the NUMEC Affair. It's obvious to him and any serious person who looked at the people in the plant and their backgrounds and all of this evidence that there was a diversion, and yet there was never any accountability. And today people only know NUMEC in Apollo, Pennsylvania, because it's the site of a cleanup that could cost American taxpayers up to $500 million.
That's right. I mean, there's so many different aspects to this story, but it seems to me that this is the type of system that was set up to fail from the beginning. It brings to my mind why the Navy would have to contract out to this private firm to get their fuel processing done in the first place. Certainly the Navy had their own fuel reprocessing centers or were able to do that type of thing.
They certainly could have kept private industry and Zalman Shapiro in particular with his, tiny facility out of the stream of uranium, particularly weapons-grade uranium. But the mandate at this period of time was to jumpstart private industry and get processors into the business, not only for Navy fuel, but for civilian fuel as well. So the Atomic Energy Commission had this dual mandate of regulating an industry which was, full of safeguards problems and also promoting it at the same time. And they were so bad at it and had so many conflicts of interest that they were abolished, and we formed the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and split up the functions. But you're right, it didn't have to happen. But the wrong people were in the right place at the right time, and over a 10-year period managed to get their hands on enough weapons-grade uranium for dozens of simple gun-type weapons or advanced weapons.
Do we have an idea how much material went missing from the Apollo site?
The estimates, I don't have the figure in front of me, but it's north of 500 pounds. It's an amount that if you look at the amount as a percentage of the loss is 2% of all the material that went through the plant while Zalman Shapiro was there. It only declined to industry standard losses after he had left.
And industry standard's about 0.2%?
Yeah, about 2.2%. So the actual quantity, according to a Department of Energy 2001 study, the most recent audit, was a substantial amount. I don't have the exact figure in front of me, though. I'll find it in a moment.
Well, there's just so much to get into with this story, but let's clarify. So there is no smoking gun per se definitively linking Shapiro and NUMEC to shipping this to Israel, but we have lots of pieces of the pie there, and we have eyewitnesses and others that have come forward over the years, and together it makes quite a compelling case.
Right, it's 337 kilograms of material. I've positioned this as no smoking gun, but all smoking shell casings which lead from Apollo, Pennsylvania to Dimona. And when I say that, it's referencing the CIA station chief who characterized NUMEC as an Israeli operation from the beginning. It's commenting on Carl Duckett, and we've got some leaked CIA documents from Carl Duckett who said that he believed that there was a diversion from NUMEC, although we didn't know about Zalman's culpability. And, again, the fact that the material shipping port, uranium, which was specially designated for the NUMEC plant, was picked up in Israel by some clandestine services. All of that, to me, points to the fact that there was a diversion. Now, Zalman Shapiro denies it. And in terms of the many civil lawsuits that are currently underway trying to get damage settlements and health settlements, nobody has gone after Zalman Shapiro or the Israeli government. But there are also a large number of the most sensitive documents that are still classified being held by the LBJ Library, the Ford Library, and the Carter Library of the National Archives and Record Administration. And so what has happened is that as time has passed, the evidence for diversion has been stacking up much faster than the evidence for no diversion.
Well, a lot to go into, but there's some callers on the line, obviously generating some interest in this this conversation. So let's get some of your views in. Once again, if you want to get in, 1-800-313-9443. But let's go to Bill in Idaho. Bill, thanks for waiting on the line.
Excellent work as usual, gentlemen. Very much appreciated. Hopefully the sleeping Christian church, the Judeo-Christian church in America will hear this any more than that foolish and, I feel, ill-willed comment out of the DNC most recently. But on page 193 of Sword and Shield, the third paragraph on 193, the case also stoked Shamir's virulent anti-Americanism rooted in a fixed belief that the United States was particularly responsible for the Holocaust. There were claims that he believed that the President Roosevelt should have come to an arrangement, quote-unquote, one of Shamir's favorite words, with Hitler to replace Britain, then to dominate power in the Middle East, then the dominant power in the Middle East with the Third Reich. In turn, Hitler would have allowed the Jews to travel to Palestine, thus and therefore the Holocaust would never have happened. I can't thank you enough, and I'm hoping that this gets repeated any number of times. The excellent research, but going back to the discussion of NUMEC and Wisconsin, the particular time frame that you're describing from, late 60s into the 80s and 90s, remember, it was Gerald Ford that, in concert with Mr. Cheney and Mr. Rumsfeld, that covered up who murdered Frank Olson, a very, very important intelligence story, never discussed out of the San Jose Mercury News, and yet covers more than one presidency. If that doesn't wake up the sleeping church, I assume nothing will.
Well, the Frank Olson story is fascinating. So, Bill, thank you for that call. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. But we have another caller on the line. We have Eric in Michigan, so let's bring him up. Eric, thanks for calling tonight.
Hi there. I remember Benjamin Netanyahu, or as I say, Netanyahu, appearing on the Sean Insanity radio program, a year or so before 9/11, and he made this really bracious statement, schmirkish, that if Americans refuse to take seriously the plight of their Zionist brethren in Israel, that is the terrorist threats against them, that terrorism would come to America. Kind of like the PNAC proclamation of Paul Wolfowitz.
And Cheney and others.
Yeah, that we need a new Pearl Harbor or a new global American empire. But, of course, we have to enlist the highly esteemed and celebrated Judeo-Christianic evangelical community, the moral, or shall I say the moral minority, and, of course, His Eminence, the anus Pat Robertson, how else could the Israeli Mossad operative Bush Laden crime family have been elected? And also, I want to ask your guest, if he's aware of a retired British intelligence officer, Andrew Carrington Hitchcock, who authored The Synagogue of Satan, because what your guest is describing tonight is actually described in this book. And it all leads back to the infamous Rothschild, that means red sign, and strangely, their emblem, the the hexagram, the Star of David, which, according to some, translates into 666.
I thought it was the three arrows, but yeah, or the five arrows.
Seems to connect to the Rothschild family, and in fact,
all right. Well, Eric, we're coming up against the break, so let's put that question to Grant Smith. Are you familiar with that book and the work that Eric's talking about?
I'm not familiar with that. No, I'm afraid. But this constant theme of bad things can happen if the United States doesn't act is a recurring theme, and it's not just PNAC and Netanyahu. Even back in 1961, Senator J.W. Fulbright held a very serious meeting and drafted a memo saying that he was going to look into things happening overseas, like the Lavon affair, which were affecting U.S. policy. And so it's a recurring theme, and that's a very interesting point.
Unfortunately, it happens too often. Eric, we're going to have to leave it there. We're up against the break. Thank you for the call. Thank you also to Bill. And let's take a short breather, and when we come back, we'll wrap things up with Grant F. Smith of urmep.org. So hang on right there. We'll be right back.
Turn it up! I want my bail-out money. Keep the bills coming. Sweet green cash just dripping.
All right, friends, welcome back to the program. Once again, you have been tuned into Corbett Report Radio, and we have been talking to Grant F. Smith tonight of urmep.org. That's IRMEP.org. Once again, the link to that will be in the show notes for tonight's episode at corbettreport.com/radio for those of you who have missed it. But let's just wrap things up here. Grant, I mean, there's so many things to talk about and so many different issues, but so many of them come back to what is happening right now and the specter of war with Iran that we've been hearing about for so many years. And once again, we seem to be in a round of inflated rhetoric and the possibility that Israel might launch some sort of strike and get the U.S. to go along with it. So what is your take on what's happening right now and the prospect for a strike on Iran before the election?
Well, I think the issue is something everybody should be thinking about, but they should be thinking about it in the following terms. Israel has a very sophisticated nuclear arsenal, and that includes submarine-based launchable missiles. It includes, of course, things that can be launched by air and ground. And so one of the problems with the debate is that because we're so dishonest and because of strategic ambiguity, where the U.S. presidents won't answer direct questions about the Israeli nuclear arsenal, there's no debate about whether the Israelis are willing to go nuclear against Iran, which is probably the only way they actually could take out all of the facilities that they would need to take out. And so I think that that's an issue that serious people would be discussing, because the analysis that most impresses me is that they don't have conventional capabilities for actually doing any significant damage. And so that's one issue. And then the other issue is, well, what can the Israelis do to the United States? Because the big reason that the arsenal exists in the first place, or at least the CIA thought this, back in the 1961 period, they thought that it would help the Israelis avoid any sort of settlement that would cost them vis-a-vis the Palestinians. I think we're in the same situation. The Israelis, because they have this vast and growing arsenal in terms of deployed weapons, can say to the United States continually that we need to do their dirty work for them, or because all they have really is a credible threat is their nuclear weapons. And so the United States, if it doesn't want to see that, will have to attack Iran with conventional forces. So The Israeli nuclear arsenal question is key. And, aside from the fact that I don't personally believe the Iranians, based on my analysis and work, are actually developing a nuclear arsenal, the question really is, what is the U.S. being coerced into doing? And so, that knowledge of Israel's arsenal, if it were more widespread, would utterly change the debate. And I think Americans in particular would become very resentful about how that arsenal was put together at their ongoing expense. So that's probably one of the biggest reasons that the lobby works very hard to keep a lid on this argument.
Absolutely right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but just quickly, just throw out the website one more time and tell people what they can find there.
irmep.org, and look for the Israel Lobby Archive.
Excellent. A ton of information, so I hope people will make use of that archive. So once again, Grant F. Smith, it's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
All right, friends, that's it for me tonight here on Corbett Report Radio, but of course we'll be back next Monday, same time, same channel. So I'm looking forward to talking to you all again next week. Until then, thank you all for listening and take care.
There's a particular